Well, John Solomon, editor, founder of Just the News. It's great to be with you. Thanks for coming in today.
Yeah, I'm glad to do it. Exciting times.
Well, you are, man, you are at the center of everything in Washington, D.C. right now. What is it? What is it like? I want to go back over your career and your life, of course, but right now, I mean, you're just 24/7. How do you get sleep right now, and what puts
Yeah.
you in the center of everything right now?
Well, we don't have a president who sleeps much, as we can tell from his social media accounts. So if you're a reporter, you can't sleep much either. You gotta be on top of things because history is unfolding minute by minute. It is the history of the social media era. Things don't wait hours; they wait minutes now, and so you just have to adjust your lifestyle to accommodate that. But it is, I believe, the history of these last year and the next 2 to 3 years will probably set a course for America, a compass for that may last 50 years or so. We're really in a foundationally changing moment in American history, and it's not clear where the course will be. We know which way each party wants us to go. Donald Trump has a very clear policy vision, the Trump doctrine, the Dunn Road doctrine when it comes to foreign policy, and the left has an increasingly clear philosophy, looks more like Marxist, Islamist Marxist sort of combined together. But who wins that epic struggle is not yet clear. But it is clear that whatever way America chooses and turns will define the next half century of the American experience.
What has your relationship with Trump been like? First, over the years, how did you first meet him? How has the relationship been over the years?
He used to write columns for me at the, I think the first time I actually dealt with him was back in the 90s on an Indian gaming story that I did at the Associated Press. And he had some competing casinos that felt that the Indian gaming world had an unfair advantage, unfair competitive advantage. And then during the 9, 10, 11, 12 through 15 time period when I was editor of the Washington Times, he would occasionally write for the op-ed pages there. And I got to meet them and occasionally edit or be consulted on editing some of his pieces. And then in the 2016 election, met him quite a bit. Once up at Trump Tower with a really interesting meeting just to understand where he was going and what he was thinking and how different he was as a political figure than anyone who had been on the political theater stage in a long time. And then throughout, listen, we've always known each other as a president or a political figure and a journalist, and it's always stayed that way. He clearly likes to read Just the News and shares a lot of our stories, and I'm grateful for that. I mean, I'm grateful for every person that reads our stories, but when the most powerful man in the world reads them, it's very humbling. But he understands I'm a journalist. He appreciates that. I understand he's a president, but he's very kind. The night my dad died was the night before he was starting his trial in New York. And you know, it was a very difficult time for him. And he took time out of that night and called me to express his condolences for my dad. He put out a statement about my dad, and he had heard that through a third party and just did it. So, you know, it's it's an amazing moment when someone takes the time, as busy as he, to mention something about your family or express some condolences. I've got to see a little bit of the personal side of him over the years. He's a remarkably warm and cordial person when you get to know him as a person, away from the presidents and the politics. Very funny, very witty, can crack you up on a moment's notice when you least expect it, and yet at the same time, you know, projects all of that power and that tenacity that you see when he's on the world stage. So it's always been the journalist to a person that's covered by the journalist relationship, but throughout he's been, you know, really always accessible. I think when I think of every president that I've had the ability to cover, Donald Trump is by far the most omnipresent and available president. He answers questions. He addresses things in real time. He doesn't hide behind press people. And that is quite different from, you know, the majority of political leaders in this town.
Yeah, does he, does it primarily, does he call you up? Like, does he call you in the middle of the night? I know he calls other reporters. Does that happen?
I've taken a few calls after hours, yeah. Often texted, but you know, always about business. It's always about, hey, this is important, or I have something, or I read something. I remember maybe last summer there was a story that I'd worked on with Laura Logan, and it was about some interpreters who had been alongside the U.S. military for all the 20 years of our Afghan war, and they were left behind, and they had been temporarily moved to Qatar, and Qatar was about to return them to the Taliban, which meant they would be tortured and killed. And we wrote this story, and somehow on a Saturday morning he saw it, and he called me up and said, "I'm going to fix this. Watch my Truth Social account." Like 2 seconds later, he writes on the Truth Social account something to the effect, "I'm going to try to fix this if I can." And then J.D. Vance gets involved like an hour later, and those 35 men were rescued before they were going to be sent to their death in the Taliban. And that's not a unique experience. I know other journalists who, had an important story, and the president thought, "Hey, I can use the power of this office to do good." And he calls them up, and he does it. And I think that's what makes it so unique. He is the most powerful man in the world, and yet one of the most accessible. And sometimes he initiates the access, and because he saw something and he read it. He's a very large consumer of news, and he's very well read. And when he sees something that he thinks the power of the presidency can address or fix, he's not afraid to engage and try to get that solution into the marketplace.
Yeah, so this has been a great, if this were a movie, this is the opening scene of you today. And now we're going back. I want to go back in time, though, to how did you get started in journalism, and where did you come from? Where did you grow up?
So I grew up in Connecticut, right outside of a city called Bridgeport, which is a pretty rough, hard town, a little rougher than Boston, I'd say, but tough, gritty people. They all work hard. Not a city that had a lot of economic opportunity, did have a lot of crime, a lot of mob crime at the time. I grew up in a family of all Irish cops. My dad was the chief inspector for the state of Connecticut for the area that was covered around Bridgeport. So he would investigate murders every day, and he would investigate mob bosses, and was part of the New England crime task force, organized crime task force, took down some of the biggest players in organized crime. And so I grew up in a family where accountability, law and order was important. I like to write, and so I knew I was going to be a writer, not a cop. When I turned 18 and my dad said, "Hey, you can go do this, great, I love it. But I'd love you to take a couple years, and when you come back from break, work the cell block in Bridgeport, Connecticut at the Sheriff's Department, because I want you to see that side of life before you go do what you're going to do." And so for a few summers, I was a sheriff's deputy special, meaning someone would come in and give vacation relief, and I worked spell block, and I worked the door at a courthouse known as Golden Hill Street, which is where all the intake would occur every night. So everybody in the Bridgeport area that had got arrested the night before and were going to come for arraignment the next morning, we would handle those cases. And it was the greatest gift my father gave me, and my father gave me many great gifts, but he allowed me to see a life that, as I was becoming an adult, that I'd been shielded mostly in my Catholic upbringing and in the suburbs of Bridgeport, in a little town called Monroe. I didn't see these things. I didn't see people who were suffering from AIDS. I didn't see people who would move from the methadone clinic to maybe scoring another coke hit on the street and then getting rolled up by the cops. I didn't see people walk into a courthouse like one day happened with a knife, maybe hoping to create mayhem. That stuff had never happened before in my life, and it was, I think, my father's greatest gift for me to get to see that side of the world before I'd become a fully functioning adult. But I love to write, and I went to school. My dad was on a cop salary, so paying for college was going to be part my responsibility, and I got a job at United Press International back in the fall of 1984. It was a great job because I wanted to be a sports writer, and I'd played sports all the way up until that point. And so I, on Fridays and Saturday nights in Milwaukee, I would take all 300 football scores from around the state of Wisconsin, and you'd have to know how to spell and say Oconomowoc and Menominee Falls and all these incredible cities that no one had heard of in Wisconsin. I would do the prep scores. And so I did that for about 6 weeks. And then one night, Ronald Reagan was coming through at the end of the '84 campaign, the Morning in America campaign. And the famous UPI reporter Helen Thomas was on the plane. But her job wasn't to be the reporter who filed at that outing. The local UPI was supposed to cover it. Our local UPI reporter either got in a car accident because it was like a freak snowstorm that night, or something happened, and that reporter was not going to get to the event. So it's Friday night, and I remember this young guy, older guy, looking over at this kid from first freshman, 17-year-old freshman in college, saying, "Hey kid, do you have a tie?" And I'm like, "Yes sir, I do." "Put it on." yeah, do you know your social security number? No, I'll call my mom. And like, why do you need that? And you're going to go cover the president. I'm like, I'm sorry, what did you just say? You're going over to the German restaurant. You're going to cover President Reagan, and you're going to dictate. And I'm like, what's that? And like, don't worry, we'll talk you through it. Just find a payphone. And so Ronald Reagan did come through, and he did this event at the German restaurant. I did my best to dictate a story, though I'd never done such a thing at age 17. And to be honest with you, that crusty old editor who sent me out probably saved my bacon and wrote a much better story than I was capable of. And like a couple days later, I got a call from the UPI in Chicago saying, hey, we heard you did a great job. We want to hire you full time. So I went from shuffling prep scores to being a journalist at age 17. I hadn't even turned 18 yet. I think there was some exemption to the child labor laws that had to happen because I didn't turn 18 until January. And then I spent a couple of years at UPI. Then AP came a knocking in my junior year, and I moved from college from UPI to AP. And then right after I graduated college, the news editor in Milwaukee had a horrible accident. He was hit by a city bus walking on the street, was really dangerous, horribly injured. And the bureau chief in the office asked everyone, who wants to be the acting news editor? Nobody wanted to be it. So finally he looked at me, he's like, what do you know? You're going to be the acting news editor. And so I was like maybe 21 and was running a large metropolitan AP news bureau. And that went from acting to full-time. I remember when I got named as a full-time news editor, the CEO of AP called me. His name is Lou Bacardi, an amazing legend of journalism. And by the way, a man who lived by the ethos of journalism, neutrality, honesty, accuracy. I could not have worked for a greater boss or learned from him. And he called me up one day and said, I see that you're going to be named news editor, but there's a typo in the press release. It says you're 22. I'm like, no, sir, that's really how old I am. And like, well, we're going to make a typo, make you 26. No one will believe I'm naming a 22-year-old. Like, no, you can't do that, sir. Like, oh, I just want to test you. But to see if you'd be willing to do that. Like, no, I got to own up to what I am. But I became a news editor at a very young age, worked with some amazing people who trained me on the job. And then I moved to Washington in time for the '92 election. And that instinct of being a cop and being around my dad came in handy because I had a chance to do some work on Ross Perot. I was covering campaign finance, which is a beginner's beat in the AP bureau in Washington. And there was something about Ross Perot and the way he spent his money. And I called him up, and he said, well, if you really want to know how the game works, you ought to look at the Nixon archives and saw what I did back then. And I'm like, boy, that's an amazing offer. And I had no idea what he would lead me to. But what he led me to was this body of evidence that showed that the man in 1992 who said he never played the great sucking sound in Washington, he didn't play by the rules of Washington quid pro quos and behind the backdoor deals. In fact, did exactly that during the Nixon years. And I found all these incredible documents that showed that he basically bribed Nixon with $60 million, offering $60 million to burnish his image. They created a slush fund where Ross Perot was going to pay that money. And he never paid the money, but in the meantime, he parlayed the promise of giving the president money into all these favors for his computer company.
Government
and
contracts,
I broke this
right?
Yeah, lots of contracts and other things, beneficial approval, mergers and things. And I broke the story. It was really kind of funny. I had to ask Richard Nixon for permission to go into the non-public side of the Nixon archives. And he gave me a letter saying, yeah, you can. And I went and got all of these interviews that had never been public. And Ross Perot was a dirty name in the Nixon administration because they felt played by him. And I told this extraordinary story, and it forced him out of the race. He dropped out of the race within a few weeks. And to do that, I had to track down H.R. Haldeman at a bar in London, and John Ehrlichman at an investment firm in Atlanta, and Alex Butterfield, who was the guy that discovered the secret tapes. But I told a powerful story, and very quickly it had a profound impact on the 1992 campaign. He would come back. Obviously, he dropped from the race, then came back in the fall and ran again. But it gave me a sense that you could do meaningful things and find stories that had been hidden a long time if you worked hard enough. And from there, the rest is history, as they say.
So he came back and still got 19%, as I recall.
He did. And without that 19%, George H.W. Bush probably would have won.
Right.
Ross Perot took about 40% more Republican independents than Democrat-leaning independents. And so, and there's a great moment in the process of this where So I think those stories broke in March and April of '92, and they really did have a profound effect. The story broke out globally. He drops out, and then I get a call. Well, actually, I'm out mowing my lawn, and on a Sunday afternoon, and my wife comes out and says, "Hey, John, there's some guy named Ross Perot on the phone. He wants to talk to you." He had called my home number, and he wanted to tell me about some stuff about POWs in Vietnam that might have been lost on George H.W. Bush's watch and the CIA, and it led me to some important POW reporting that I did. But if you told me when I was working cell block in my freshman year of college or UPI that I'd be getting calls from Ross Perot or presidential candidates at my home on a Sunday afternoon, I would have laughed you off as that's not happening. But it did, and it gave me the bug, and God has been good ever since, and I've just been able to do that type of work.
That's great. Then after AP or UPI and then AP, you then moved on, I believe, to a number of publications. Just walk us through that quickly.
Yeah, so I was able to retire with 20 years in at the ripe old age of 39, which was a good deal from AP. And so the Washington Post, after I'd done a series of stories on Harry Reid and his ties to the mob that had been hidden for years, and some gifts and other things that forced him to change his disclosure reports. He had left certain things off of his disclosure reports. This is when he was about to become the Senate leader. The Washington Post came along and said, "Hey, we'd love you to be our lead national investigative reporter." So I thought, well, that's pretty cool. Wow. And I did that for a year. I got to learn from people like Bob Woodward and Jeff Lean, who, between them probably had 4, 5, 6 Pulitzers, and other great work from them. And then the Washington Times, the rival newspaper, the conservative newspaper, called the next year. I was only 41. And they asked me to be their editor-in-chief and sort of chief business strategist. And that was fun, because I learned some of the important sides of business, just as our journalism business was changing for the worse. Our business metrics were getting worse at the beginning of the internet era, and helped a newspaper that was losing tens of millions of dollars a year eventually reach break even and slightly profitable, and that was a great learning. Went to the Hill newspaper to help them start their television division, which ultimately would be sold to Nexstar for $147 million. Wow. While at the Hill, did the Hunter Biden stories, which first won accolades and then got me thrown out of the profession because everybody said I was a conspiracy theorist. It turns out those conspiracy theories all came true. I was right. But in that part where I was isolated and thrown out of the profession and shunned, I decided, I've been doing this for other people. I'm going to go start my own company. So a couple days before the pandemic was officially declared, I started my own company called Just the News, and that's been 6 years strong now, and we're a pretty large news presence.
You really do have those credentials that are hard to write off, right? It's kind of hard to marginalize you because of that.
Well, people did a good job. Listen, none of those credentials mattered in 2019 and 20. Lots of people abandoned me. Even though I could show them that my reporting was accurate, they weren't interesting. So I found that credentials really didn't matter that much, really. It was a painful lesson, because I felt like, hey, I'd been a good servant in the industry, and I'd won, I won some RFK journalism awards. I was a Pulitzer finalist a couple times. I had, won lots of SPJ awards, and I thought, well, certainly just because I'm coming under attack by Joe Biden, that people would look at what I said, not what Joe Biden said, and try to find out it wasn't true. They didn't care what I had reported, whether it was true or not. They jumped on a bandwagon of Joe Biden says John Solomon is a conspiracy theorist, and basically I got laughed out of town for a long time, threatened. I got attacked on the street once by someone who tackled me, angry that I dare do these things. I'd go into a store and have an autistic child, and one day I was in a Lowe's, and some gentleman came up and didn't care about how much he was terrifying my son. He just kept screaming and yelling and threatening at me. So credentials didn't matter one bit. And it reminded me of what that very first guy who gave me that first assignment covering Ronald Reagan said to me one night, which is, "You're only as good as your next story, kid, so always be working on your next story." So when I was isolated and starting my own company and shunned for a while, all I knew how to do was to take that guy's advice and go write the next story after that. And that ultimately allowed us to not only prove that the Hunter Biden saga was true, but to unravel Russia collusion, and then all the stories that we've broken in this sort of 10-year extraordinary run where government went out after a lot of innocent people just to get Trump and to make sure that he couldn't be viable as a political candidate. So being thrown out turned out to be probably the best thing in my life. Who knew?
What do you think of Megyn Kelly's proposition that now that they're in power, the right has got to punish the left for what the left did, or else it'll keep happening? But if the left feels the pain, they'll stop next time. Any merit to that?
Listen, I think when you look through it through a political lens, you're just as bad as the left who did what they did to Donald Trump. I think what you really need to look at it is when people break the law, there has to be a consequence, and if there isn't, there is no deterrence. And so I don't think Donald Trump's job is to go and say, I don't like you because you're a lefty, so I'm going to pay you back. I'm going to make up a fake scandal like you did to me, which, by the way, if he did it, I think a lot of people say, well, he's entitled to do that after what he went through. But that's not what I believe is going on. It's not consistent with what I see. They are going after people that concocted some of these things, but they're going after them solely because there's evidence of crimes. And I think if you put it in the, and I haven't seen Megyn's exact comments on this, so I don't want to exactly blame whatever it says, but anyone who puts it in the context that it just should be a red, blue, or us and them thing, they're only stooping to the level of what happened in 2016, 17, and 18, where you looked at the person and decided if they were a criminal. We ought to look at the actions, decide if the crime, and then figure out what the person is that committed that crime is. I believe that that's what's going on now. I know there's a lot of bluster, and every so often Donald Trump will say, I can't wait to get that guy. Quite frankly, what he's been through, if I were through it, I'd probably have the same chip on my shoulder. But I think the system is trying to apply the law that it is meant to be. And if you punish people because they legitimately created a crime regardless of their political stripe, you're going to make the country better and you're going to create deterrence. If you do it just to get a Democrat behind bars, you're no better than the people that you claim that you were replacing.
Have we always been like this as a country, or is this a recent phenomenon to politicize or to criminalize our politics and try to get your opponent into jail instead of defeating his ideas?
I think there's always been, we are a rough and tumble country. We had manifest destiny because we weren't afraid to go out into the wilds and face the most grievous threats to do what we wanted to do. And that restlessness that is at the heart of the Americana and the experience that we are as a nation makes us rough and tumble. So our politics have always been rough and tumble. Listen, you could go back and see how the whispers were about Thomas Jefferson and his slave lover back in the 1800s. And there's always been the illegitimate child story here and there.
Right.
It happened in the John McCain campaign in 2008 and before. So those things have rough and tumble, mean-spirited politics. Even the point of trying to file a criminal complaint against your opponent, it's all throughout history. What the last 10 years is different is that it was the institutions themselves, the Justice Department, the CIA,
right.
that were initiating, sustaining, or continuing something for which there was no evidence. That is a little bit different. The FBI was under the control of Richard Nixon, but when they realized that Richard Nixon had committed a crime, even though he was their guy, I mean, technically their boss, they began to investigate Watergate and had to go to the media to get the cover to do so, as we now know, Mark Feld being Deep Throat. But in this era, that's not what the FBI did. The FBI said, we don't like Donald Trump, and we're going to just find some crime and hang it on him. And when it was obvious that Hillary Clinton had concocted Russia collusion, and they even intercepted the idea that it was going to be fake, which we now know they did, they continued to pursue it. I think that's what this era is different. The people who called balls and strikes suddenly decided it was going to be all strikes all the time, regardless. And if you're ever a baseball player and an umpire calls a strike on you and it's 7 inches off the plate, you know how mad you are. I think that that's what began happening in politics, and it wasn't the politicians. They always do it. Prosecutors, FBI agents, IRS agents, intelligence agents, intelligence analysts, people that had stayed above the political fray suddenly got dragged down into it. And I think that's what's been the most corrosive part of these last 10 years.
Are Democrats better at using government, both for these purposes and for legitimate purposes? I mean, think about it. The Republican or the conservative side doesn't like government fundamentally, Ronald Reagan, et cetera.
Yeah.
So is one side better at it?
I think both sides now try to leverage it in different ways. I think the Democrats made a significant investment. There's a document I unearthed many years ago. It's in 2014, I think, and it's at a George Soros event. I think it was Transparency International, or it was some event where he had all of his peeps together. And he talked about the need, hey, we've not normally traditionally engaged the State Department and the FBI and the Justice Department, but we need to make friends there. That was the nature of the whole conversation. It wasn't all George Soros, but it was the Soros machinery talking to its own people. I got a hold of this document, and they started making investments in institutions that perhaps in an earlier era, liberals would say, that's the FBI. Those are the bad guys. We reject them. We were protesting them back in the 60s. And they started making investments in them. And they started, one of the most shocking stories that I did at the Hill was for a good period from 2014 to 2018, far left groups were routinely funding junkets for FBI agents and prosecutors to go overseas and go to exotic places, warm places in the winter, cooler places in the summer. And it was an opportunity for the Soros left machinery to make friends and to grease the palms and to get some goodwill. And one of the very first people who would go on one of those junkets that I could track would later become the agent who found, and I put that in air quotes, the black ledger that was used to prosecute Paul Manafort and to legitimize a part of the Russia collusion case. And then as soon as she got that job done, and she took down the president's campaign chairman and gave credence to a Russia collusion narrative that we now know from the John Durham report wasn't substantiated, she took a job with one of the Soros groups. And I think what Soros and the left did is, after years of saying Wall Street's bad and cops are bad and the FBI is bad, the Justice Department's bad, and the military is bad, they began to co-opt those institutions with hope that they would become woke. And you saw a woke military in the final years of Joe Biden. It wasn't an accident. You saw a woke FBI that was weaponized against Trump. It wasn't an accident. There was an investment and influence plan that was being executed during the Obama years that allowed them to make the sort of friends that could turn those institutions against their enemies. And I think that that isn't fully appreciated yet. I think maybe we see some of that with the SPLC indictment just the other day, that the SPLC got so close to the FBI that they felt like they could go have their own informants and pay bad racists to create racist things so they could call groups more racist. And they probably didn't fear being caught because they had made those partnerships with the FBI. You see the FBI under Kash Patel ending those relationships, creating distance again. Hey, we're the FBI. We don't get co-opted by special interest groups. We do our job. And I think that the more the FBI moves back towards independence, the Justice Department moves back to independence, the CIA and other agencies move back to independence, the better government becomes. The more it becomes co-opted by one political side, either through graft or junkets or whatever it took, the worse our machinery becomes. And I don't know how this ends yet. I will tell you right now, the course that we're currently on leaves us looking more like a banana republic than the great constitutional republic for which we've mostly survived the first 250 years operating as. And there are many, many things that bother me. This is a story that I can't believe I got to write it because it almost feels like fiction. In fact, 10 years ago, if I came in and suggested a story like this for a Hollywood movie, they probably would have laughed me out of the Hollywood studios. But you had CIA agents, excuse me, CIA analysts who were writing reports during the Biden years saying that a mother who chooses to have children is more likely to be a domestic threat. Just want to remind civilization that without mothers giving birth to children, none of us are here today.
Wow.
Somewhere, that became the normal thinking in the intelligence community. And that, by the way, has no national security merit. Do we really think childbearing moms have a higher propensity for terrorism? Not that I know of. Most of the terrorists I know are single men, the hijackers on 9/11. So I do think that we see now such insanity that has allowed to fester in places that kept above politics and indoctrination. I don't know if it's reversible. How the Trump administration punishes people, if they do it credibly, there might be a deterrence. If they do it lacking credibility, all it will do will become an us and them. Whoever's in power will prosecute all their enemies, and then every president's going to have to pardon their entire world before they leave every time, and it'll be a laughing stock for the rest of the world that used to look at us as a shining beacon on a hill.
You know, it's got to be really, really tough to be a foreign government with the kind of whipsaw governments we have.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, is there a case to be made that we do need kind of a deep state that has some continuity to it? What do you think about that idea?
I'm not sure a deep state enforcer is the way to go, because at the end of the day, that would mean that unelected people have the say, and our founding fathers intended that it would be the elected, responsive people, the people responsive because they had to face the electorate every 2, 4, 6 years to be the deciders. So I'm not sure having a consistent deep state is the issue. I think what happened is, for most of our history, certainly in modern history from the Truman era forward, foreign policy began by defining what is the American interest. And then whatever the American interest was, we then would agree what foreign policy was. And quite frankly, there wasn't much difference between a Bill Clinton and a George W. Bush when it came to foreign policy, because we agreed that foreign policy and security policy was above politics. Domestic policy has always been a little bit more contentious and fractious. But somewhere along the way, the American interest was removed from the equation, and foreign and security policy became as hyperbolic as domestic policy. And I think that that's what's made that whipsaw moment. I think in an era after Donald Trump has left office, there may be a chance to adjust those dials back. I don't think the Democratic Party can survive as a Marxist party like it's tumbling towards right now. And the Republican Party has to come to its own senses about what it stands for, and not have to be poked and prodded every day by Donald Trump to do whatever the party-defining thing is. And so there could be some dials adjusted later, but I do think that returning to an idea that we can all identify the American interest when it comes to foreign policy will probably be the best way to keep things a little bit more consistent. Empowering a group of bureaucrats who never are responsive to the electorate, probably not what our founding fathers vision. In fact, they probably feared that.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't exactly in defense of the deep state, but it just occurs to me that
it's a good question, though. It's a very important question.
You know, there were some wise people over the last 75 years who had reasons for doing things, and it's got to be very challenging. I mean, you think about the transition from Biden to Trump for the foreign policy, for the foreign leaders, to try to track that is just incredible. I was invited because I was making a movie on Ronald Reagan to speak at CPAC in 2011, and Trump was speaking the same day. I have to tell you, I completely missed the Trump phenomenon coming down the road. Did you see it coming? When did you see what was going to come?
No, I think I may have given a speech as early as December 2015 saying I'm not sure that, that the Republican Party was ready for Trump. Now, I could see that Trump had extraordinary stage presence and extraordinary capability to suck the oxygen out of the room. I didn't think the Republican Party was ready for him. He made the Republican Party ready for him by bypassing it and going to that worker with a hard hat on, or that working class family, or that union member, or that mom at home who didn't feel her voice was heard, and he literally bypassed his party until he owned the party. And it is quite a remarkable thing. I think in the last 20 years, there have been two extraordinary presidential campaigns that probably exceed most in the history of our country. Barack Obama's 2008 digital tether campaign was revolutionary because he was the first politician to realize the internet could take somebody who lived 700-800 miles away from you, who you never met, maybe 3,000 miles away from you, and make him feel personal to you.
Right.
When Barack Obama found out Sharon Stone was your favorite actress and he knew your birthday, all of a sudden you'd get a message on Facebook during the 2008 campaign. Hey, I'm Sharon Stone and Barack Obama told me it's your birthday. He'd say, happy birthday. That was really kind of crazy. Everybody knew it was a little crazy, a little fake, but it was like, wow, Barack Obama feels real to me now. That campaign, the digitalization of American politics, also digital fundraising was born in that 2008 campaign. Perhaps one of the most important moments in American history and modern politics. And then Donald Trump being able to show that you can literally defeat the establishment by going around it, not having to bend a knee to it. You could break the establishment if you needed to. You can call Marco Rubio, Little Marco, and Sleepy Jeb and not pay a consequence, because what you were saying was probably in the back of the head of the working class. And like, I kind of agree with Donald Trump. He is sleepy. Or why is he so small? Why did he drink water during that speech? And I think that Donald Trump did something that proved that the status quo didn't have to be the status quo, that elitists didn't have to always have the last word. And I think Barack Obama and Donald Trump are the two most transformative presidents in the post-Reagan era.
Oh.
And just because of the different capabilities, they're very different philosophy-wise, very different personality-wise, very different policy-wise. But I think their impact in changing the nature of politics will be remembered long beyond their presidencies.
Yeah, that's such an interesting observation because obviously there are so, Obama operates behind the scenes, right? He's
Right.
leading from behind, all that stuff, right? And Trump just kind of barrels through stuff. And you can sort of see Obama's hand even at Virginia event yesterday,
Yeah.
right, where the election,
Sure.
the redistricting plan, he
Yeah.
sent Eric Holder out. So what does this mean in a post-Trump, post-Obama era? What does this do to other candidates? How has Trump impacted the Rubios and the J.D. Vance of the next generation?
Yeah, it's a great question. If you told me at the beginning of this Trump presidency that Marco Rubio and Donald Trump would be alter egos for each other, I would have not a chance. They're so different. Marco Rubio was slow to recognize that Russian collusion was a delusion, but man, they have just found a connectivity together. And I think what happens is, if you know Donald Trump as the guy on the other side of the camera, the news reporter at the speech or on the stage, and you've never been in a room with him for some time, you have this one impression. Then you get in a room with the man and you have a deep conversation with him. And by the way, he can have very deep conversations. And all of a sudden you're like, this guy's really smart. I didn't know there was this whole other side to him. And I think the Marco Rubios and J.D. Vances of the world see that. And, it comes with a cost. You got to put up with some of the social media antics and the temper tantrums. You get that. But on the over-under, there are very few people who have held that chair, and there's only been 47 of them total, that have sat behind the Resolute desk. Actually, not all of them sat behind the Resolute desk, but sat in the Oval Office.
Right.
And that have the level of four-dimensional chess that Donald Trump is playing every day. I think one of the funniest things I always laugh at is Democrats who think that Donald Trump just did something because he was intemperate. He thinks through every aspect. There have been times where I've been sitting with him in some capacity, and he's like, watch what I'm going to do next. And he thought it through. Then he does it. And like, oh my God, he had a strategy behind that. I think he uses that to his advantage, that the Democrats who now clearly have Trump derangement syndrome, listen to how they're running in the 26th election. The only thing they can tell you that they have a policy on is, we're going to screw Donald Trump. We're going to impeach him. We're going to stop him. The Democratic Party has no policy anymore except getting Trump, stopping Trump, making a humiliation of him. And I think that's to the detriment of the Democratic Party. And meanwhile, the Republican Party, if you had told me the Republican Party would have come up with no tax on tips and no tax on Social Security and no tax on overtime, like, no, that's a Democratic policy. No, Donald Trump stole some of the great platforms of the Democratic Party through sheer ingenuity and intellect, and he flipped them around and he stole them from the Democratic Party. And the truth of the matter is, and I know this from interviewing some of the people around Hillary and Joe Biden, the Democrats hate Donald Trump more, not for his personality, but for the fact that he keeps outfoxing them and steals parts of their constituencies that they have taken for granted for a half century. Blacks, Hispanics, young men, women, young voters. And it bothers the living dickens out of him that he's gone into their camp and stole their people. And that's why they hate him more than anything else.
I won 9 dinners off of my very smart friends in 2016 because I did predict a Trump
Good
victory.
for you.
But it wasn't because of some sophisticated polling operation.
Yeah.
I kept meeting Uber drivers and taxi
Yep.
drivers. And I had two security guards in my neighborhood, one black, one Hispanic here in California, and they were both voting for Trump. And I said, are you guys Republicans? And they said, oh, we're Democrats. They had to re-register as Democrats to vote for Trump. That's when I knew that something really crazy was coming down the road.
That's amazing. What a great bellwether, and what great vision you had to see that in real time. There's nothing like ground politics to tell you what you can't learn anything from polling. Polling can be manipulated by every decision you put in. How I word the question, what size is my sample? What's the Republican versus Democratic say? Some of these polls that have Trump way below 50% of the economy, their Republican samples are at 23 or 26%. Well, Republicans make a lot more of the population. So, but you can't hide reality if you sit in an Applebee's, or if you're in an Uber, or if you're out at the grocery market and you start talking the bodega and you start talking politics. So, brilliant move.
The waitresses and the cab drivers. Now, I understand your 4D chess analogy, but and you're not I would say you are not a Trump hater journalist, Trump derangement center, whatever. But are there moments when you go, wow, I hope this doesn't go bad? Like when he did the Iranian civilization comment, for instance. Do you have moments where you're concerned?
I'm concerned every day for the future of this country, no matter who's in charge. And I'm gravely concerned by the level of vitriol that we've created for ourselves. It's exactly what our enemies intended us to do. And I think a lot of the evolution of social media from foreign operations is designed to create conflict between us.
Right.
A few short years ago, I had a chance to meet a long-serving, like 45, 50-year serving Cuban intelligence officer who defected to the United States a few years ago. He was in his late 70s, early 80s. I mean, this was a savvy son of a gun, and basically started with Castro. And he said by the end of his time, he did more work for China and Iran than he did in Venezuela than he did for the Cubans, but because the Cubans would outsource their best intelligence agencies to their foreign funders. But he said, we have a playbook. We've used it for years. It still works today. First thing is, don't waste your time on older generations. Find young people and focus on young adults and while they're still influenceable. Get them in the schools, get them indoctrinated. The second is to create conflict wherever it exists. The third notion of our playbook is to make the abnormal normal. So when you think about, wait a second, a man just stood on the women's podium and took the gold medal. What? We're going to make that normal? That is ripped out of the Marxist intelligence playbook that the Cuban intelligence agencies had. And the fourth is your best middleware to achieving this plan are teachers. And he had a name for them in Cuba, what the groups were. They don't have unions in Cuba, but they had these affiliates of teachers, and he said we would use them, and if we handed them our indoctrination, we would make sure that the Cuban children would grow up to be Castro-loving kids, and then we would take that same model and try to get it done. And so think about how much teachers have had a detrimental effect on children in the last 2 decades, telling them that they could become women even though they were born men, and they could do it without their parents' blessing, or teaching them that the color of their skin, CRT, DEI, would determine their entire lifestyle, basically flipping the Martin Luther King promise on its head. It's no longer about merit. It's about you're destined to become an oppressor or an oppressed based on the color of your skin. Teachers embedded that in not one but 2 consecutive generations of our children. And if you look at where those storylines came from, they came from Marxism and communism and socialism in Cuba and Russia and China. And so when I heard this man, I started to realize, wow, maybe what's been happening here isn't an accident at all. And I think that most Americans are just starting to wake up to the idea that this hasn't been an organic evolution of American thinking. It's been a forced one in which allies here in the States are working with allies overseas, enemies overseas, to perhaps force change here that's antithetical to the American experience.
Well, wasn't the real Russian collusion that they were funding both sides? They were funding meetups on the right, meetups on the left to try to encourage us to fight each other?
That has been going on since the Cold War was begun in the 60s. So,
but didn't we actually catch them funding Facebook activities?
Yeah, no. The truth of the matter is Russian involvement in the 16 and 20 election was less than in prior elections. It wasn't that big a deal. A few $100,000 on each side.
Right.
Where the real origins of Russia collusion are with Hillary Clinton's own desire to neutralize her greatest liability. And I think when we were going into the 2016 election, we thought that Hillary Clinton thought that the email scandal was her number one liability because it was breaking in real time. I actually played a big role in the discovery of the email server and the fact that it was in David Kendall's office and the State Department Inspector General was there. But it turns out her internal polling, which I would later get in my book that I published in 2020 called Fallout, it was a poll they did, and it went through all the scandals: Whitewater, Bill's infidelity, the China money fundraising scandal, which was a big deal in the Clinton era, her fake donors, and her email scandal, that those weren't the number one registering one. It was the storyline that Peter Schweitzer told in Clinton Money in 2015, the fact that the Clintons had taken all of this money from Russia. That was showing up as the number one detrimental thing that people had a reservation about voting for Hillary Clinton. So they invented Russia collusion to neutralize that liability. And what I like to talk about the grand conspiracy now, because Kash Patel wrote a memo, and Todd is now, and his prosecutors in Miami and in Fort Pierce are now using that memo to prosecute what they call a grand conspiracy cases. It's a wash, rinse, repeat cycle. And what do I mean by that? Hillary Clinton has a Russia collusion problem of her own. It shows up in her polling. They decide they're going to hang a fake shingle of Russia on Donald Trump's campaign house. Okay, that worked out pretty well because the FBI and the intelligence community helped. Then as soon as Donald Trump's cleared of that, I break the stories about Hunter Biden, Burisma in Ukraine at the Hill in March and April of 2019. Joe Biden's got a Ukraine problem. What do? They hang our fake Ukraine Russian scandal on Donald Trump. And how fake was the Ukraine scandal? Well, the documents I just got released by Tulsi Gabbard make it pretty clear. The whistleblower knew nothing firsthand, was politically biased, and was caught lying. In any other era of American history, that complaint would never have been sent to Congress. But in the Donald Trump era, Democrats have a liability. They project it on Donald Trump, and they start another criminal / impeachment proceeding. Then in early 21, Joe Biden just started his presidency, and his aides go to his old house and his old office like, oh my God, he had classified documents here. He's got a classified documents problem. What do? They invent the Mar-a-Lago raid. And it's actually the Biden White House that tells the National Archives, hey, by the way, they haven't told the National Archives that Joe Biden had some documents yet. Go sick the FBI on Donald Trump.
Wow.
And then in 23, when wash, rinse, repeat cycle number 4 begins, it's clear that Joe Biden has a mental acuity problem. He's declining mentally. They decide that they're going to go back to 2021 and make a criminal case out of the notion that Donald Trump and his supporters tried to go get alternate electors and submit them to the Senate on the morning of January 6th. Now, that's kind of funny because anyone who knows history knows that happened twice before.
Sure.
John Kennedy did it in 60. Sam Tilden did it in 1876. It was not deemed criminal then. It was deemed to be protected under the rights of a citizen to protest government action.
Right.
But under Donald Trump, it becomes criminal. By the way, 3 years after it happened they're suddenly concocting it back up. In each of those instances, here's an interesting thing that a lot of people don't know. In each of those instances, they created a code name investigation at the FBI to treat Donald Trump as a national security threat. A man twice elected by the American people, the FBI was treating as a national security threat. Crossfire Hurricane is Russia. Round River is Ukraine. I'm going to forget now the document. The Plasmic Echo is the classified documents case, and then Arctic Frost is that final one. For 10 consecutive years, the FBI and the intelligence community did the bidding of the Democratic Party and its neutralization strategy by taking their concerns and their wants and wishes and turning them into counterintelligence investigations that targeted Donald Trump and all of his followers. More than 1,000 innocent people have been impacted by that decision. That's something we're just starting to become reckoned with.
Wow. Well, my last question for you is really about the crack up on the American right, which I think is going to probably usher in amazing results in this midterm election. But what do you attribute this to? Is this foreign influence? And even back to, is it crazy to think This is not about Israel, by the way, but is this crazy to think that a foreign power could have instigated or been a part of the assassination attempts on Trump and the taking out of Charlie Kirk because they knew it would create a domestic disturbance like it has?
I haven't found that evidence that would suggest that a foreign power was behind it. But there is plenty of evidence that the people who did these things had foreign ties and were influenced by foreign thinking and were following sites that were infused with foreign propaganda and foreign efforts to make Americans hate each other.
Right.
And to me, that is perhaps one of the most scary things at all. A few miles from where Charlie was assassinated in Utah, there's another group, and I think it was called Armed Queers of Salt Lake City. Now, Salt Lake City is a Mormon city. It's not a big area for LGBTQ if you look at it geographically or psychographically. But for somehow this group there, it had ties all the way to the Cuban regime. They were meeting with the Cuban regime a few months before Charlie Kirk was assassinated. Now, that doesn't mean they're involved in the shooting, but if someplace in conservative Utah had a cell of people that was working with the Cuban intelligence world, you have to ask yourself what's been going on. And then remember what we learned on TikTok, why we ultimately forced the sale of TikTok to Americans, because we were learning that China was using the algorithm to poison our children's minds to kill themselves.
Right.
What's China doing right now? They're making the precursors that the drug cartels put into fentanyl, and now the even worse than fentanyl drugs, and they're killing our children. So is there explicit proof that foreign powers are trying to destroy America with intelligence and propaganda operations right now? Yes. Are there Americans assisting that? Absolutely yes. Every drug gangbanger that's moving fentanyl on the streets here are doing so at the behest of the Mexican cartels who are doing it on behalf of the Chinese precursor makers. The new Peter Schweitzer book lays out a whole strategy of how China and Mexico overtly, he literally has the quotes of elected leaders in Mexico and China saying that we're going to use birthright citizenship to create a conquistador moment in America. So are those things going on right now? Yes. Are certain elements of our American society enabling it? Yes. The open border strategy enabled Mexico and China to fulfill that. The open borders allows that strategy to allow fentanyl to come in. So aiding and abetting has occurred here, and the foreign powers behind it are pretty clear what their goal is. They want to destroy and eliminate America as the great superpower of the world.
Will we ever know who tried to kill President Trump that day in Butler? If there was somebody behind it?
Yeah, I think we know, right? I mean, I haven't found anyone who could say, well, that wasn't the guy that did it.
But I mean, what his backing was? Was there any backing? I mean,
yeah, I think as far as I can tell, and I've done a lot of reporting on this, and I think there's some new documents that went to Congress that like Congress always does, they sit on stuff for a long time. But I think when people see the totality of the evidence of what allowed the FBI to come to its conclusions, it is going to be what it is. This young kid gets radicalized by a bunch of weird philosophies and people, and he's in a relationship, and there's this furry stuff. I don't even fully understand it. But those groups are designed to corrupt the minds of our children, and they do have, some of them have alliances overseas. But did someone send a message to the Butler shooter or to the Florida shooter and say, hey, kill Donald Trump today? No, not like the 9/11 hijackers got their working orders from Osama bin Laden. It's a little bit different.
Right.
I think our enemies hope that if they just create enough chaos, enough abnormality, that these things will happen organically, and that's exactly what that Cuban intelligence agent told me.
Well, John, it's great to visit with you today. Thanks for walking us through your life and career and giving us behind the headlines what's going on. Thanks again.
Well, thanks, my friend, and congratulations to all you've done. That recent re-debut of the Reagan movie in Japan was a marvel to see. You are an American hero who's done so much to educate us, and so I'm grateful. I want to end with one thought, because I don't think I've ever told this story publicly, but
yes.
I had a chance to interview George H.W. Bush maybe about 15 years ago. It was right around the time he had been diagnosed with Parkinson, and he kind of wandered on in on his walker, and we had really about a 5 or 6 hour conversation. It was very profound. I was the editor of the Washington Times at the time, if I recall correctly. And most of the day was about policy and his family, and did he ever think his sons would become president like him? But at one point, we tipped into the Reagan conversation. And you know this because you made the move and you're a student of history, but a lot of people forget how vitriolic the Bush-Reagan 1980 primary was. That was a slugfest. And in fact, most of the things that became attack lines against Ronald Reagan by the Democrats were invented by Bush's campaign.
Voodoo economics.
Yeah, voodoo economics, bonds, all the ones that got thrown out there. But at the end of the day, when Ronald Reagan made a decision that it was best for the country for him and George to become a unified party, that going back to Ford wouldn't make sense, because you can't be a former president, go back to being Veep. It just wouldn't work. You were used to being president. He kind of shocked Bush. I don't think Bush thought it was coming. Bush told me, if you told me I was going to be Ronald Reagan's pick, I would have laughed you off. But he said that the morning after he got the call, they met for breakfast and they went through all the pleasantries. You're going to go on the campaign trail. We're going to do this. Here's our messaging points. And then just before they were going to dismiss the breakfast, this is George H.W.'s account of the conversation. He said, "Governors, any last advice you have for me before I go hit the trail?" And Governor Reagan looked at him and said, "George, I think you're going to get this. You're a military man. I think this is you're going to get it right away. If you're ever in our foxhole in the future and you pull the pin on a hand grenade, for God's sake, throw it on the other guys." And I think that's a classic Reagan line, right?
That's good.
But
By
there's
the
a
way,
profoundness. There's a profoundness to that needs to be reminded. When I watch this internecine warfare of the Tucker Carlsons and the Megyn Kellys and others who probably making a lot of money on conflict inside their conservative movement, I think Ronald Reagan's wisdom to George H.W. Bush probably is more prescient today than it was in 1980. And I would encourage a lot of people today to live by that, which is there are real enemies in the world. Most of them are not the guy or woman sitting next to us.
that's a great insight. That's a great insight. We are not each other's enemies. We have some very, very serious enemies that are 100 times worse than the person you think you disagree with.
Hell yeah.
Politically. Yeah. Thank you, John.
Good to be with you.
All right.